In this session we are going to discuss about the cardio dynamics. So we have heard about cardiac output. It is heart rate into stroke volume. What is heart rate? Heart rate is the number of beat per minute. What is stroke volume? The volume of blood released during per contraction. So when it is multiplied, we get heart rate. We get the cardiac output. What is cardiac output? The number of volume of blood released multiple per minute. Cardiac output is volume of blood ejected from the heart per minute, which is typically 5 liter per minute. 5 liter of blood is released per minute. That is the normal cardiac output. Next is what determines the cardiac output. So we already discussed that it is the product of heart rate and the stroke volume. So it is determined by stroke volume and it is determined by the heart rate. What is stroke volume? Per contraction, volume of blood released per contraction, heart rate, number of beats per minute. So this determines the cardiac output. So the average cardiac output is 5 liter per minute. That is the entire blood supply circulates once per minute. The entire blood supply circulates once per minute. Which is very important. The entire blood supply circulates once per minute. That is a cardiac output. So the cardiac output is equal to heart rate into stroke volume. So the heart rate are influenced by chronotropic and the electrical events. So the heart rate or the number of beats per minute is determined by the chronotropic influences and the electrical events. Next is the stroke volume. What is stroke volume? Stroke volume is influenced by inotropic influences and mechanical events. So the mechanical contraction of the ventricles can have an impact in stroke volume, and the chronotropic or the electrical activity have an impact in heartbeats. So that all occurs the cardiac output, which is per minute of blood released from the body, which is 5 liter per minute. So the electrical activity and mechanical activity have a multiple value or the product value of change in heartbeat. Product value difference or the product value can have influences in the heart's cardiac output. So the heart rate depends on tissue satisfaction with nutrients and oxygen. So we discussed that the heart rate is depend on the chronotropic influences and the electrical activity. So the heart rate depends on the tissue satisfaction with nutrients and oxygen. Next is terms. So the heart rates have different terms: bradycardia, tachycardia. So the bradycardia is heart rate is lower than normal. So the heart rate is very low. So that is bradycardia. Because the stroke volume and carbon dioxide increases, it is due to because heart rate decrease. So it has a inverse effect, I think. So if the heart rate is too fast, there is carbon dioxide and oxygen satisfaction with nutrient decreases. So that tissue have effect in the heartbeat, and the heartbeat causes the stroke volume, and CO2 increases in the heart, and the stroke volume also have effect. So the heartbeat have effect on stroke volume. That is known as bradycardia. So the heart rate is less than normal value. That is bradycardia. Next is tachycardia. Tachycardia means heart rate is faster than normal. Next is regulation of heart rate. Autonomic nervous system. We discussed about the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system is influenced by the medulla oblongata and oblongata and the in the motor neurons that helps in the simulation of parasympathetic nervous system due to the and the simulation is passed to vagus nerves, and this causes decrease in heart rate. So the parasympathetic and the sympathetic are connected by interneurons, and there is decrease in heart rate, that is chronotropic effect. Next is increased AV node delay. So the AV node delay is increased, so it causes heart rate decrease. So the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system has decrease in heart rate. First is there is decrease in heart rate, which is a chronotropic effect. Increase in AV node delay is known as dromotrophic effect. There is chronotropic effect, there is dromotrophic effect, there is inotropic effect, chrono, ino, and dromo, chrono, dromo, and ino. So there is decrease in heart rate, which is chronotropic effect. There is increase in AV node delay, there is dromotropic effect. Next is only a tiny effect on contractility. So the parasympathetic have only a tiny effect, or there is no connection of parasympathetic into the contraction. So parasympathetic effect only affects on the nodal area of the heart. So sympathetic nervous system, that increase the heart rate because it has the connection of AV nodes, SA node, SA node and AV node, and the contraction of ventricular contractions. So it increases the heart rate and it increases the force of contraction, which is a positive chronotropic effect. What is decrease in heart rate is known as decreased chronotropic effect. The increased heart rate is known as positive chronotropic effect. So the increased force of contraction is positive inotropic effect. So if there is delay in AV node, that is dromotropic effect. When there is when there is increase in force of contraction of ventricles, that is inotropic. Increased force of contraction. So parasympathetic nerves helps in the increase in the contraction of increase in the heartbeat and the increase in the force of contraction. That the increase in the force of contraction is known as inotropic effect, and the increase in the AV node delay is known as dermotropic effect, and the increased heartbeat is known as chronotropic effect. What is dermotropic effect? Dermotropic effect is the increased delay in the AV node, which has negative dromotropic effect. So if there is increased contraction, that is a positive inotropic effect. So next is reflex control. So the brain bridge reflex atrial walls, which is due to increase in venous return and causes increase in heart rate, responsible for 40 to 60% of heart rate are increased by increase of venous return. So when the venous return is increased from the body, the heart rate also increases, which is responsible for 40 to 60% of heart rate. Venous return, increased venous return, which is a reflex control of the brain bridge reflex. So the brain bridge reflex is the atrial walls reflex. So the venous return is controlled by the atrial walls. So the atrial walls are controlled by SA node. The SA node is controlled by brain bridge reflex. So the SA node is produced from brain. Next is baroreceptor reflex. The baroreceptor reflex is baroreceptor is a heart rate increasing positive reflex. So it is in the aortic and carotids. So the baroreceptors are seen inside the heart of the aorta and carotids, which cause the increase in BP, which is an effect that baroreceptor are occurs when the BP rises. So the BP rise, baroreceptor reflexes increases, and it causes decrease in heart rate and decrease in contraction and increase in vasodilation. Vasodilation means the expansion of venous. So the chemoreceptor reflex, there are three types of reflex. One, the brain bridge reflex. Next is the baroreceptor reflex and the chemoreceptor reflex. The chemoreceptor reflex is due to the low oxygen rate and increased carbon dioxide rate due to the increase in the contraction. There is carbon dioxide, the increase, and oxygen supply decreases, and this causes the chemoreceptor. So there is a chemoreceptor inside the heart which identifies the amount of carbon dioxide and the less amount of oxygen. It is seen in the peripheral tissue, which increases the heart rate and increases the respiration rate. So if you want to increase the respiration rate of the lungs, we have to do chemical receptor reflex. We have to activate the chemical receptor reflex. If you want to decrease the heart rate, what we have to do? We have to stimulate the baroreceptor. If we want to increase the heart rate by atrial connection, we have to stimulate the brain bridge reflex. So there is three type of reflex: the brain bridge reflex, there is baroreceptor reflex, and there is the last one, the chemoreceptor reflex. That's three type of reflexes. Next is the stroke volume. So we discussed about the heart rate, the terms of heart rate, the bradycardia, the decrease in heart rate, the tachycardia, the increase in heart rate, the autonomous, how the heart rate is regulated by the autonomous nervous system, which is the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Parasympathetic, what happens? Parasympathetic decreases the heart rate by decreasing the activity of AV nodes, and which have less connection in contractility, and the sympathetic nervous system, which causes the increase in the heart rate, which is by the contraction, increase in the force of contraction. So the increase heart rate is known as chronotropic effect, and the increase in the force of contraction is known as inotropic effect. The increase in decrease in AV node delay is known as dermotropic effect. So increase in AV node delay D. So we can use D as demotropic effect. Next is the venous reflex. So the venous reflex, the force of contraction. So the force of in. So in means inotropic, inotropic effect, positive inotropic effect in sympathetic. Next is the chromotropic. Chromotropic means increased heart rate or decreased positive chromotropic, or increased positive chromotropic and decreased negative chromotropic effect. Next is there is reflex control. Which are the reflex? The brain bridge reflex, which is the atrial valves. Next is the baroreceptor, which is in the aortas and the carotids. Next is the chemotropic reflex, which is due to the increase in carbon dioxide and decrease in oxygen, and this causes the increase in heart rate and the respiration rate. So next is the stroke volume. So the stroke volume is blood output per heartbeat. So the blood output per heartbeat means by heartbeat. So it is equal to stroke volume. So the total output of blood is equal to stroke volume into heart rate. So the output of blood by heart rate is equal to stroke volume. So the blood output per heart rate, we can say the blood output per heart rate is stroke volume. So the stroke volume is equal to end of diastolic volume minus end of systolic volume. So the output of blood per heart rate, one heart minute, one beat, number of hearts per minute, number of heartbeats per minute. So the number of heartbeats per minute is divided by the blood output. So that is the stroke volume, the release of heart, the release of volume of blood per minute. So the stroke volume is equal to end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So the diastolic volume we discussed earlier, that the diastolic volume, end diastolic volume is equal to ventricular volume at end of diastole, where ventricle is at fullest. So end ventricular diastole is when ventricular contraction doesn't occur and the ventricular is at relaxation. So the myocardial relaxation of ventricles is the end of diastolic volume. That the minus means less than end systolic volume. So when we subtract the ventricular relaxation, when the blood is inside the ventricles, it relaxed, minus the release of the myocardial contraction, what we get the stroke volume. So we can imagine in the first phase there is myocardial relaxation, so the blood is inside the ventricles. In the second end systolic volume there is contraction, means the blood is going out. So the output of ventricles or the contraction causes the output of a certain volume of blood to out of the heart by number of heart rates per minute. That volume is known as stroke volume. So the stroke volume can be identified by blood output divided by heart rate and end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So next is SV, stroke volume is increased by ventricular filling time. So the stroke volume can be increased by the increase in diastolic volume. The myocardial relaxation volume or the end of the relaxation volume, if the relaxation is so the filling of ventricle is increased, there is increase in stroke volume. So the greater the subtraction value, the diastolic volume will be increased. So the ventricular filling time is proportional to stroke volume increase. So it is duration of ventricular diastole. Next is ventricular return. So venous return. So the venous from the venous supply from the body is increased by atrial contraction or the stimulation of SA node. So when the venous return is increased, the stroke volume will increase because atrium is contraction and the ventricle is relaxing. So the stroke volume will increase rapidly when the venous. It is all connected. According to a side of the blood supply, the force is connected. So the positive force from the venous, the ventricular filling time is also a positive force or the same direction of force. So it has the increase. This two type of force has a proportional effect in the stroke volume. Next is the arterial BP, means blood pressure, arterial blood pressure. So the arterial blood pressure decreases, the stroke volume increases. So when the atrial pressure decreases, when the contraction increase, the atrial pressure increases when the contraction decrease. So the atrial pressure decreases, the ventricular stroke volume increase, which is proportional, and venous return increase, the stroke volume increase, and the atrial, so venous filling increase, which is also same force with the venous supply. So the stroke volume increase. Next is the atrial. When the atrial pressure or the atrial blood pressure decreases, the ventricular contraction increase, so the stroke volume increases proportionately. So when the blood pressure is higher, there is increased stroke volume, which causes harder to eject blood, which increases ESV. Next is Frank-Starling mechanism. So we discussed the Frank-Starling mechanism in the last point. It is preload. What is preload? Preload means the ventricle myocardial is relaxed due to the stretching of the muscles. The ventricle is filled. So this causes the increase in preload and the cross-linking of myofibrils. It increases stretching, means the cross-linking of myofibrils increases, and this causes increase in contraction. That is the Frank-Starling mechanism. So the Frank-Starling mechanism. Frank-Starling introduced that when the diastolic ventricular pressure, during the ventricular diastole, the heart muscle stretches, so it causes increase in ventricular relaxation or the filling up of blood which is known as preload. So the increase of preload increases. When the preload increases, the cross-link between the myocardial fiber increases. Myofibrils increases. The cross-linking with the myofibril increases, which causes increase in contraction. So when the preload of blood increases, the contraction increases, or the cross-linking of the myofibrils or the stretching of myofibrils increases. So the contraction of blood or the stroke volume is increases. So the stroke volume is proportional to preload of blood. That is the Frank-Starling mechanism. So the Frank-Starling mechanism is connected at this point. It is very important that when the preload of blood increases, may be due to the sympathetic effect of the SA node in the atrium, or the atrial pressure decrease, or the atrial pressure is increased. There is decrease in the ventricular contraction, which causes the preload increase. When the connection of atrial pressure is inversely proportional. When the blood pressure increases, the contraction decreases, and when the contraction decreases, the pressure inside the ventricles decreases. That is the chart. When the atrial pressure decreases, the contraction decreases. Ventricular contraction decreases, and due to the ventricular contraction decreases, the preload decreases. So when the preload is decreases, the stroke volume also decreases. That is the parasympathetic effect. So the preload also have impact in stroke volume or the heart rate, which is proportional to the heart rate. So when the preload increases and the stroke volume increases, the contraction increases, the stroke volume increases. Ventricular filling time or the preload is increases, the stroke volume increases. The venous return or the atrial contraction increases, the stroke volume increases. So only there is only inversely proportional, there is only atrial blood pressure. When the atrial blood pressure is higher, it is hard to eject blood. So there is no pressure differences in the atrial. So it causes the ESV to increase. ESV means end systolic volume. So the end systolic volume, the end ventricular relaxation volume increases. Contraction volume increases. What happened? There is increased pressure in the atrial, so the blood pressure is higher, which causes harder to eject the blood. So when there is increase in end systolic volume, there is a decrease in stroke volume, because the blood is harder to eject.